Washington is using the Taiwanese to provoke the Chinese. That's what I think is happening. Just like they use the Ukrainians to provoke the Russians. And this is why you see these two guys holding hands. The only reason why they're holding hands is because the Americans want to use the samurai to go against the Chinese. That's it. That's the only reason. There is an interesting history of admiration for the Japanese in Turkey. Really interesting stuff. There was a book written about this whole topic, of one of those obscure history books that no one reads, but it was written by some historian. I think it was called Dreams of Japan or something like that. Great book. I mean, if you're interested in the fascination for Japan that lies in Turkey. But for a very long time, the Turks have been fascinated with the Japanese, and I'm just gonna, you know what? I'm just gonna put this screen up, guys. The Young Turks, the secular Turkish nationalists who took over the Ottoman Empire, they were very, very fascinated with Japan. And the reason why they were fascinated with the Japanese was because in Japan, you have this synthesis between Asian culture or Japanese culture and maintaining that Japanese culture, and the absorption of Western technology, military technology and the like. So the Japanese during the Meiji era, there was this revolution. There was this innovative revolution that took place within Japan. So there was some guy, he was a military leader, American military leader. I think his name was Matthew Perry. And Mr. Perry, he moved a big old fat steamboat in front of the Japanese coast. And the Americans told the Japanese, it's time to do trade with America. Now, at this point, Japan had been in isolation for centuries, and one of the reasons why Japan went into isolation, or the main reason I should say, was to prevent Christian influence from entering Japan. Christianity entered Japan through the Portuguese. A lot of the Japanese converted to Catholicism. And then what that ended up doing, believe it or not, was causing a war, because you had a lot of the Shintoists who hated Christianity, and then you had the Catholics who were actually destroying Shinto idols, and boom, eventually you had a war that lasted for a while. And believe it or not, the Dutch Protestants entered that conflict, and they sided with the Shintoists to defeat the Catholics. So believe it or not, there was a religious war that took place in Japanese history. It's really fascinating. And you had people, I'm telling you, I think if more and more Catholics knew this, they would lose their minds. They would lose it, because the trad Catholics are fascinated by Japan. But believe it or not, there were Catholic samurai in freaking Japan at one point in time. Yes, you can look into this. They were Catholic samurai. In fact, I know that there is at least one statue of a Catholic samurai in some small town somewhere in Japan. They have a statue of him to remember him. He was a Catholic samurai. I wrote a whole article about this years ago. If anybody wants to read it, I'll give you guys the link in the chat. But there was a whole bunch of Catholic samurai. These were samurai who followed the law of Bushido, but they were Catholic. And they said, you know what? We're going to declare a holy war on Shintoism. And there was a Japanese lord who owned he owned a whole bunch of land, and he converted to Catholicism, and he said, I want no pagan idols on my territory, none whatsoever. So he ordered the destruction of all Shinto idols on his lands. And eventually a war broke out between the Shintoists and the Catholics. And the Catholics, they put up a hell of a fight. The Catholics went, Shimabara Rebellion, that's correct. I forgot the name, but yes, that is correct. You reminded me. Shimabara Rebellion. And the Catholics got into this giant tower, and they held on to that tower. They said, this is our fortress. And the Shintoists didn't really know how to overtake the tower, and so the Dutch came in and they said, oh, we got cannons. And so the Dutch used their cannons to help the Shintoists defeat the Japanese. defeat the Japanese Catholics. And the Japanese Catholics were defeated, and the Japanese said, we don't want any Christianity to enter Japan ever again. So they went into isolation for, I want to say, what was like 200, 300 years, something like that. They went into isolation for centuries. Well, the Americans knew about Japan, and they said, listen, we got to make sure that those Japanese do some trade deals with us because we want to make money with them. So we want to make money out of them. So the Americans sent this guy, Colonel Perry, to direct a big old steamboat engine ship to the coast of Japan, and they told the Japanese, damn it, Japan, you better do some trade with us. And the Japanese said, okay, well, we're not really that interested. We're enjoying our isolationism here. And the Americans said, okay, fire the cannons on the ship. Boom, 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 fired the cannons. The poor Japanese had never seen anything like it. They were terrified. They were utterly filled with consternation, didn't know what to do. So they said, okay, we'll do trade with you. So they started doing trade with the Americans. Well, this commenced the Meiji era of Japanese history. This is what began the Meiji era of Japanese history. And the Meiji era was this extreme watershed moment. It was a very, very significant moment in Japanese history where Japan began to absorb Western military technology, Gatling guns, cannons, the whole thing. So the Japanese started absorbing all this weaponry, all this technology. And this was the beginning of the end for the samurai culture, because the Japanese said, okay, we got to have a unified country. We got to have a central government. We have to be under the emperor. No more feudalism, none of that sort of thing. So this began really the death of feudal Japan. There were some samurai who held the line, and this is what the whole movie, The Last Samurai, was based in. The whole movie, the whole story of the film, The Last Samurai, which is a great movie, by the way, takes place in this context. And so this began the era of modern day Japan. And this really was the origin story of the beginning of Japan being a regional superpower in East Asia. And it began the story of Japan being a major, major threat to Chinese power. The Chinese, I believe, have been a unified country much longer before the Japanese became a unified country. And so the China had a lot of influence in Korea, and Korea was a big central place for China's sphere of influence. But the Japanese, they absorbed all this Western technology, and they became this very innovative country. So what happened was, in Korea, there began this movement that said, hey, look at what the Chinese are doing. Look at what the Japanese are doing. The Japanese are absorbing Western technology, and we Koreans need to start doing the same damn thing. So there began this pro-Japan movement in Korea. And there was also this movement in Korea that was very, very pro-China. So it was the pro-Chinese Koreans versus the pro-Japanese Koreans. Now, what does that remind you of? North and South Korea. You have South Korea, which is an ally of Japan, even though the South Koreans have their own grievances with the Japanese because of what the Japanese did to them during their occupation of Korea, wherein the Japanese raped countless Korean women and did all sorts of horrific atrocities, especially during the Second World War with the comfort women, which a lot of the Japanese still deny. But South Korea is still technically an ally of Japan, and South Korea is an enemy of China. And then you have North Korea. North Korea is extremely anti-Japan, but it's also very pro-China. It's an ally of China. So like I said, we're all about making history come alive. We're all about animating history and seeing history as a lesson, as a teacher. And so you see in history this division in Korea between pro-China and pro-Japan. And what do you see Korea today? What do you see happening in Korea today, right? Division. Korea is divided between North and South. The North is pro-China, the South is anti-China and as an ally with the Japanese. That may change in the future. Who knows? As I like to say, the future will always surprise us. But that's one example of history coming alive. And so what happened was the Japanese, they were interested in controlling Korea because Korea was very rich in, I want to say, coal and iron. So the Japanese were very interested in getting those natural resources. The Chinese were very fixated on making sure that Korea remained within its sphere of influence. And so what happened was the Japanese and the Chinese, they were vying over who was going to be the big controller over Korea, who was going to control Korea. So what eventually happened was you had a riot that broke out in Korea, and the King of Korea, who was an ally of the United States, the King of Korea, he said, hey, we got this big old riot happening. We need some help. And I believe the riot was being done by people who were pro-Japan, but there was a riot, and the King of Korea requested the military assistance of the Chinese. The Chinese answered the call, and they sent, I want to say, several thousand soldiers or something like that into Korea. They sent a large deployment of soldiers into Korea, and the Japanese saw that, and they said, oh, well, that's not good, because there was a prior agreement between the Chinese and the Japanese that they would not deploy troops into Korea, because there was a situation that happened where there was another riot that broke out, and then I think it was an anti-Japanese riot, and some Japanese officials or some Japanese guards or officers were murdered by the rioters. And so eventually the Japanese and the Chinese, there was conflict between the two, but they decided not to escalate the situation any further. So the Japanese and the Koreans made an agreement affirming that they would not have any sort of military activities within Korea. Well, this riot breaks out. China deploys troops into Korea, and Japan said, what the hell, China? You're not supposed to do that. So the Japanese then send troops into Korea, and then a declaration of war was made, and a war broke out between the Chinese and the Japanese. And this is the beginning of the First Sino-Japanese War that began in 1894 and ended in 1895. And the Japanese won. Now, what's interesting is that people actually did not expect the Japanese to win that war. They didn't. They did not expect the Japanese to win that war because the Japanese had a smaller population. The Chinese had a massive population. I want to say they had hundreds of millions of people living in China at this time. And then what happened was, well, the Japanese won. And the reason why the Japanese won, even though they had less manpower than China, the Japanese had that Western military innovation. And that Western military innovation gave the Japanese the edge to defeat the Chinese. Even though the Chinese had a massively bigger army, the Chinese still lost, which means numbers aren't always everything. Numbers are not everything in a war. They're not. And we can see that in the First Sino-Japanese War, and that war ended in 1895. In that conflict, the Japanese took Taiwan from China. China controlled Taiwan. The Japanese took Taiwan, and the Japanese then occupied Taiwan. And thus begins the whole conflict between Japan and China over Taiwan. And and this was back in the 1890s, late 1890s, not 1990s, late 1890s. Fast forward to today. And what do you see? Tensions between the Chinese and the Japanese over Taiwan. Not a damn thing has changed. Not a damn thing has changed. And they're still talking about Taiwan. And they're still talking about Taiwan and Japan and China. It doesn't end. It doesn't end. It's like the war between the Arabs and the Jews. It doesn't end. Oh, we have a ceasefire. Yeah, wipe your ass with it. This doesn't mean shit. And so what do you see today? You see the Taiwanese government saying, oh, China is a stealth enemy, and they're a great enemy of ours. And what are the Taiwanese doing? They're poking the bear. And any time there are tensions between China and Taiwan, you best well damn believe that the Japanese are eyeing that whole situation. Why? Because the Japanese used to control Taiwan. They used to control Taiwan. And just as the Turks want to revive their empire and want to retake Crimea, because Crimea was under the Ottoman Empire, the Japanese, they want to control Taiwan. The reason why Japan focuses on the whole China-Taiwan tension is not because the Japanese, out of the goodness of their heart, really care about Taiwanese sovereignty. It's because they want to control Taiwan. That's the bottom line. They want to control Taiwan. Taiwan warns of growing Chinese threat, partly to secure Trump's support. There we go. And as I've said before, Trump is going to be what? More focused on China. That's what I've said. I've said this for a while now. Trump is going to be more focused on China. And it says here, for decades, Taiwanese leaders have performed a delicate dance of defending Taiwan's sovereignty while not provoking Beijing. So the policy for Taiwan for decades has been, don't poke the Chinese panda bear. Don't poke the panda bear. Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te is changing that. So we have ourselves, everyone, a Taiwanese Donald Trump. Ah, yes, a prodigy of Taiwan, yes. A Taiwanese Donald Trump, yes. Lai last week, I love how this dude's last name is Lai. Oh, Lai, don't lie to me, man. Stop playing. Lai last week labeled China as a foreign hostile force, something no other recent Taiwanese president has done. Under his watch, a Chinese influencer living in Taiwan has been ordered to leave after supporting Beijing's view that Taiwan is part of China. Damn you, don't say that Taiwan is part of China. You will be deported from my country immediately. Don't you insult Taiwan telling me that we are the same country as China. China is big dragon beast. He has called for reviving martial law era military courts. Oh my God. This guy's serious. He has called for reviving martial law era military courts to better punish spies leaking national security secrets to China. And he has pledged to increase Taiwan's defense spending to 3% of its gross domestic product, and that's not going to be enough for the Americans, a level not seen in more than a decade. Yeah, 3%. I think the Trump administration wants them to spend like 10% of their GDP on their military. All of this risks angry retaliation from Beijing. That's the whole point. The whole point is America trying to provoke the Chinese, just like they wanted to provoke the Russians. They were working to provoke the Russians. I don't think the United States had any sort of actual intention of bringing Ukraine into NATO. I don't think the Americans even seriously wanted that. I think the Americans wanted to provoke the Russians to invade Ukraine so that the Americans could have a reason to sell all sorts of weapons and make all sorts of money and then kill a lot of Russians in the process and weaken and drain Russia of manpower. I think that was the whole goal of this thing. Everyone and their mother knew that Ukraine wasn't going to win. Everyone knew that. And so they wanted this war to happen. They provoked the Russian bear. They provoked it enough. The Russians said, okay, we're invading Ukraine. They invaded Ukraine. And now we have 1 million dead people from both sides, 1 million dead people. And the Russians have lost a lot of manpower. They got drained by this conflict, even though the Russians are technically, they are the winners. They really are the winners. And the Russians are calling the shots in these negotiations. They're saying, nope, no European soldiers in Ukraine. We will not accept it. If you put European soldiers in Ukraine, if you put any European soldiers in Ukraine, that will be an act of war, and we're not going to like that. So the Russians are the winners, but at the same time, the Russians have lost a lot of men, and that's not good, especially for a country that has such a low birth rate. And Russia has a low birth rate. That's a huge problem for them. So the Americans are trying to provoke the Chinese. The Americans want the Chinese to invade Taiwan. They do. They want the Chinese to invade Taiwan so they can sell a bunch of weapons to the Japanese and they can sell a bunch of stuff to the Taiwanese. They don't give a shit how many Taiwanese are killed. They don't care. As long as Chinese people are being killed in the process, that's all good for the Americans. This is how they think. They're sick people. Not all Americans, obviously, but the people who are doing these policies are sick people. So what happens if then the Japanese get involved? Remember what Donald Trump said when he was president? I think this was back in 2017. Donald Trump said that Japan is a samurai country. Remember that? You can look into this. Trump said Japan is a samurai country and they need to be buying more weapons, more stuff, more of this, more of that. Believe me, all this nonsense about Trump hating war, it's bullshit, guys. It's bullshit. And I said this from the beginning, that it's all deception. It's all subterfuge. If Trump can manage to do a deal where the war can be paused, that'll be great. It'll be great. But there's not gonna be a permanent ceasefire. There wasn't gonna be a permanent ceasefire between Gaza and Israel. Israel is butchering people yet again. I mean, it's all bullshit. And as I have said many times, there will be blood, right? So anytime you get into these types of conflicts, what do you see, right? There's always these conflicts are always rooted in history somehow. These conflicts are always they're always based on a very long history of bloodshed. So if you look at Russia versus Poland, Ukraine versus Russia, a lot of bloodshed. There's a big history of violence there. Soviet Union starved a bunch of people. It's all there. It's very ugly. So it's very difficult just to say, okay, guys, stop fighting each other. America doesn't give a shit, and what America does is it exploits these grievances and it exploits these tensions so that wars can happen, because America is a war economy. We are a militarist economy. We spend a ton of our money on freaking military. We spend a ton of our money making weapons, making toys to kill people. This is what we do. And so if Taiwan gets invaded, oh, that's great. We can make money. And if you look at all these NATOists in the media, if you look at all these pro-NATO talking heads on Piers Morgan or wherever, they always say the same thing. Anytime someone says, hey, I don't want my tax dollars going to fund a war in Ukraine, they always say the same thing. That money goes back to the U.S. economy. That money goes back to the American economy. Because that's what that's about at the end of the day. It's about money. And what does the Bible say? The root of all evil is what? The love of money. That's what this is. So if Taiwan gets invaded by China, America will love that. That gives a reason for American militarism. That gives a reason for the American military-industrial complex to make a lot of cash. And it's all just an opportunity. Japan will buy a ton of weapons. Japan will start making their own thing. Japan is already in the process of making its own fighter jet. The Japanese are growing. They are really coming back to their old militarism. And I suspect that there's going to be a war between the Japanese and the Chinese again. I think there's going to be a third I think there's going to be a third Sino-Japanese war, just like there was one in 1994 and just like there was one that began in the 1930s. But remember Donald Trump, he said Japan is what? It's a samurai country. Samurai, why? Because Trump is all about Japan boosting up its military again. Trump wants Japanese militarism to be revived. The Americans want Japanese militarism to be revived. And let's go back into history a little bit. What happened during the Vietnam War? America was doing this crazy, pointless war in Vietnam. Tons of people were dead. Millions of people died. Tons of American soldiers were killed. And the Americans wanted the Japanese to join in on the fight to help the Americans fight the Vietnamese. And the Americans told the Japanese, could you guys, we know that we told you after the Second World War that you guys can't be involved in war anymore. We know that in your constitution it says that the Japanese forsake war, but could you guys sort of throw that off for a second here? And yet, we want you to bring back your samurai ways. And you know what Japan told the Americans? Japan told the Americans to F off. They said, we're not getting involved in this bullshit war. And the Japanese were right. Why would they get involved in a bullshit war? The nuking of Japan was still fresh in their memories. World War II was still fresh in their memories. Tons of Japanese being killed in World War II was still fresh in their memories. And they just made a promise not to be involved in war after being nuked. And they made the promise to the very country that nuked them. So why in the hell would they get involved in some war in Vietnam? So the Americans for a long time have actually wanted the Japanese to go back to militarism. And in fact, the Americans even, I want to say this happened back in the 1950s. the U.S. government even wanted to get Japan to have nuclear weapons. And the Japanese said, no, we're not interested because we got nuked and we don't want to be involved in that shit. So the Americans for a long time have been wanting the Japanese to revive their militarism. And now it looks like their plan is going to happen because of all this tension with China. And all this talk about how, well, you know, the Japanese are not really reliable. This is what Trump has been saying. So it looks like the Japanese are going back to militarism. To be honest, at this point, I think that if there is a World War III because of the rise of extremism, it's probably going to be many different wars rather than one side versus one side. What's your opinion on this? I think that you are correct. Yes, I think there's going to be multiple wars, multiple fronts. I think there's going to be a Sino-Japanese war. I think that there's going to be a Russo-European war. And I think there's going to be a Turco-Germanic axis. And I think that the Germans are more than likely going to form a military alliance with the Japanese, like what happened in World War II. So it's very interesting. What happened in World War I was that there was a Turco-Germanic alliance against the Russians and the British, and then by the time you go into World War II, Turkey is just a neutered country. It's literally just a neutered country. It doesn't get involved in war. There are people in Turkey at this point who were pro-Nazi, but Turkey was not really involved in the war in any serious way. And so what happened in World War II did not happen in World War I. In World War I, Turkey was in a military alliance with the Germans. So what's going to happen in World War III? I think what's going to happen in World War III is what the Turks and the Germans could not do in World War II, which was to form an alliance. And I think the Germans and the Turks are doing that right now. So yeah, I agree with you, Mr. Shia Shomaz. Where are you from, by the way? Good question. So it says here, all this risks retaliation from Beijing, etc., which has been ramping up threats to seize Taiwan by force if it does not come willingly. And it comes at a time when it's not clear whether the United States, Taiwan's main military backer, would step in to help. And it's not totally clear what the United States will do. I think if Taiwan and China end up going to war, I think that the Americans would definitely supply weapons to the Taiwanese, but I'm not sure if the Americans are going to have boots on the ground. I think that the Americans would definitely also intensify Japanese rearmament, and they would their desire to use the Japanese as a proxy against the Chinese would definitely intensify, and would definitely come out more and more out in the open. That is a fact. But I'm not entirely certain what else the United States would do. I'm not entirely certain if the United States is actually going to do boots on the ground in Taiwan. I don't know. So it says here, we are moving toward conflict escalation with China. That's for sure, said Chong Han Wu, a professor in the Department of Diplomacy at National Chengchi University. And China, they will respond for sure to all of Lai Ching-te's strategy and comments. In a fiery speech, Lai said Chinese infiltration, from recruiting members of the military as spies to ordering Taiwanese celebrities to echo Beijing's view, had reached new levels. By its actions, China already satisfies the definition of a foreign hostile force, he said last week. We have no choice but to take even more proactive measures. So you see these tensions building up between Taiwan and China. And again, this goes back to this American plan to get the Chinese into war so we can have an excuse to kill Chinese people. And this is also about getting the Japanese to return to the war path, to the path of war. And so this article says here, but there is another important audience, China hawks in President Donald Trump's administration. And you have people who are very interested in hitting the Chinese and weakening China. And these people are in Trump's circles. And this is what they want to do. And I suspect that NATO wants to use the Uyghurs. They are the Muslim people who dominate the Xinjiang province in western China. And so I'm suspecting that the Americans want to use the Uyghurs on one side, and they want to use the Japanese and possibly the South Koreans on the other side in the east, and hit the Chinese as much as possible, drain China, weaken the Chinese, and I think this is what they want to do. The announcement of the plan was likely also an attempt to secure more support from Trump and from the Trump administration, and to rally support for Lai and the DPP, said Amanda Shao. So this is what the Americans want to do. They want Taiwan to spend more on its military, and so the Taiwanese president, he's saying, look, Trump, look at how much of a hawk I am. Look at how much of a hardliner I am. Look at how anti-China I am. I'm so anti-Chinese. I hate the Chinese just as much as you do, Trump. Look, Trump, support us. That's what this is about. Taiwan wants to highlight for the U.S. the dangers it continues to face from China. And this is the same game that Zelensky played. Look, they're going to go to war with us, blah, blah, blah. We need American help. Look at how much of a victim we are. We're such victims, etc., etc. Your Chinese accent is killing me. I'm glad you like that. Yeah, I'll do more of it. Under Trump, who recently suspended U.S. military support for Ukraine to force Kiev into a ceasefire deal with Russia, that ambiguity is now even more pronounced. Taiwan can't defeat China in a war. No matter how much Taiwan spends on its military, it's not going to be able to defeat China in a war. I just don't see that happening. So what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to Japan having an opportunity to step up and to flex its muscles. Remember, let's go back to the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894. I keep thinking of the 1990s. That's how much of a dinosaur I am. Let's go back to the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894. What was that war over? It was over who was going to control Korea. And what do you see right now? Korea divided between North and South. But what happened? What was one of the consequences of China losing to Japan in 1895? The big major consequence for the Chinese was losing Taiwan. Japan took over Taiwan. And even though the Chinese had bigger numbers, they had better manpower, all that stuff, the Chinese still lost, and they were humiliated in the process, and the Japanese took Taiwan. And the Chinese lost Taiwan. And so the Chinese are very, very sensitive over this whole issue of Taiwan being a part of China. And this is why when Donald Trump was president the first time, he said, I just got off the phone with the president of Taiwan. And the Chinese got all pissy about it, and they said, what are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. There's no such thing as the president of Taiwan. Taiwan is China. Two China policy. And so there's this whole thing in America that's been honored for decades. It's called the two China policy or something like that. It's basically saying, okay, listen, we don't want to piss the Chinese off. We don't like the Chinese, but we don't want to piss them off at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're just going to say, yeah, we consider Taiwan to be part of China just to please the Chinese. And what does Trump do? He says, just got off the phone with the president of Taiwan. Wonderful, wonderful person. Love this person. Beautiful, beautiful human being. Beautiful human being. And what do the Chinese do? America, what the hell are you doing? What are you doing? You're supposed to follow the two China policy. Taiwan, not autonomous country. Taiwan, part of China. That's part of China. So there's all these little geopolitical happenings taking place, and they're all rooted in history somewhere. And now the Japanese and the Chinese, they're fighting over freaking rocks. Isn't it amazing that World War III is going to happen over rocks? So it says here, under Trump, who recently suspended U.S. military support for Ukraine to force Kiev into a ceasefire deal with Russia, that immunity is now, we already read this. Trump has said that Taiwan, which like Ukraine lives in the shadow of a much bigger neighbor with territorial ambitions, should pay us for defense. When asked last month whether Trump would adhere to the long-standing U.S. policy that China should not take Taiwan by force, Trump refused to comment. The president's nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, said earlier this month that Taiwan should be spending more like 10% of its GDP on defense. So they want the Taiwanese to buy more American weapons, to buy more American technology. That's what this is about. Now, interestingly enough, Mr. Elbridge Colby, he was with Trump during his first term. And Elbridge Colby was the guy who said years ago, back in 2022, that the United States will focus more on China. He said this back in 2022, years before Donald Trump got reelected, this most recent time. In this most recent election. So Elbridge Colby already knew the game plan. The game plan is already there. This is going to sound kind of weird, but I don't believe that policy is strictly and solely determined by the president. I don't believe that. A lot of people believe this sort of thing. They're like, oh, look, this president did this and this president did that. Okay, fine. Not saying the president has zero hand. I just don't think he's the only hand. I don't think the president is the only hand involved when it comes to foreign policy. I think when it comes to things like foreign policy, there's a whole army of people with various different influences, and you have think tanks who get involved, and you have the intelligence agency that gets involved, and I think that there are other people who really call the shots. And the fact that Elbridge Colby back in 2022 already said the U.S. is going to be more Sino-centric, it's going to be more focused on China as opposed to Europe, and the fact that he said this years before Trump won really tells us that there is a game plan, and that the president, I think, he simply fits a certain purpose. So Obama fit a certain purpose, right? What was the purpose for Obama? Well, under Obama, you had the Arab Spring, you had the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, you had the Syrian Revolution, and the Obama administration was arming the rebels. The Obama administration was really close to Turkey. Turkey had aspirations to invade Syria, and these sorts of aspirations and these sorts of actions were happening in the midst of the Obama administration. And then with Trump, you had more of this idea of Europe needing to become more independent. And here's the thing is, even before Trump got elected, the Europeans were already talking about becoming more independent. So it's not like the Europeans were just sitting around saying, oh yeah, we really love just being dependent on the Americans. The Europeans already had this plan years in advance. They were just looking for the opportunity. And what Trump did, and I think this is one of the purposes of Trump's presidency, what Trump did and what he has done is he has pushed the Europeans to accelerate that process of becoming more militarily powerful. And really, when I mean Europeans, I'm talking Germans. For the most part, I'm talking the Germans. Because if there is a massive pan-European military bloc, it's going to be ran by the Germans. It's not going to be ran by a Keir Starmer, some British guy living in London in an island somewhere. It's going to be the Germans. Just strictly from Germany's history, strictly from Germany's industrialness, Germany's innovation, technological innovation, and just from Germany's geopolitical location. It's right there in the heart of Europe, very, very centered right there in Europe. It's next to Poland, it's next to France, it's next to all these different countries. So if there is a war in Europe again, Germany will be heavily, heavily involved. Just like during the 30 Years' War, most of the battles during the 30 Years' War were taking place in Germany, and that was regardless of the fact that the Swedes were involved and the French were involved and the Norwegians were involved in that conflict, and Germany was at the center of that conflict. World War I, Germany was at the center of that conflict. World War II, Germany was at the center of that conflict. So anytime you're going to have a major war in Europe, Germany is going to be at the center of it. Germany being right at the center of that continent and not being an island far away from Europe is going to have much more strategic importance than the UK. Not saying the UK won't be involved. I wouldn't be surprised if the UK and Germany make an alliance against the Russians. But what I am saying is that Germany will be of major strategic importance in a European-Russian conflict. What about France? I don't know. I think the French could make an alliance with the Germans against the Russians. I know that the French have nuclear weapons. They have several hundred nuclear bombs, and they want to try to make their own little nuclear security umbrella. But I also do know that the Germans are on their way to becoming a nuclearly armed country. That I do know because they've been talking seriously about it for years. And Germany has the capacity to make nuclear weapons in a matter of months. I mean, that's just a fact. So I think the Europeans eventually are going to be making more nuclear bombs, and the Germans are going to make nuclear bombs, and they're going to say, all right, we got nuclear bombs. America, we're ready. We're ready to go. And I think there's going to come a point where the Americans are going to have a choice. Do we join the Europeans against the Russians, or do we join the Russians against the Germans and their allies, like what happened in World War II? It pains me to say this, but I suspect the Americans are going to join the Germans this time against the Russians. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I think that what America is doing right now is and I've said this before, the two biggest enemies of Russia, Germany and Turkey, two biggest enemies. Poland is also up there, but not as big as Turkey and Germany. And so I think what the Americans are saying is, okay, who are the biggest enemies of Russia and Russia's history? Turkey with their Ottoman Empire, and the freaking Germans in World War I and World War II. Get those guys powerful. Push them to become powerful. Push the Turks to become militarily independent. Make Turkey the second most armed country in NATO. And so, push the Germans to go back to militarism. This is what the Americans want. That's what the Americans want. Because they want to make a big, giant dog and sick it on the Russians. A big old fat Turco-Germanic axis. And I think that's what this whole thing is about. I think all this Trump stuff, I think all this idea of Trump hating war and Trump wanting peace with the Russians, I think a lot of this is just subterfuge. I think a lot of it is deception. I think it's just America saying, okay, Russia won the war. We got to make a big-ass proxy against the Russians. And it's just like China. Why does the United States arm the hell out of Japan? Why is the United States so interested in making Japan strong again? It's because the Americans want to use the Japanese as a proxy against the Chinese. It's the same reason why you go on the media, and there's all this talk about the Uyghurs. Uyghurs are being persecuted. Uyghurs are going to camps. Do you think the media gives a shit about Uyghurs? Do you think the U.S. government gives a shit about Uyghurs? No. The only reason why America cares about Uyghurs is because Uyghurs are a massive population in Western China, and they can be used as a proxy against the Chinese. It says here, Taiwan's de facto ambassador in Washington, Alexander Tae-Rui, told the Washington Street Journal last month, the U.S. president's transactional approach has unnerved many in Taiwan, home to 23 million people who are subject to near-daily incursions of Chinese fighter jets, drones, and military vessels crossing or nearing the median line, an unofficial sea border in the 110-mile-wide strait. And it says here, some fear Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, whom Trump has repeatedly called a good friend, might use Taiwan as a bargaining chip in a trade deal, just as many observers say he is trying to do with Ukraine. In his dealings, I can totally see this. With Russian leader Vladimir Putin, Xi, China's strongest leader in decades, has said reunification with Taiwan is inevitable, even though Taiwan has never been ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. Jason Xi, a former legislator in Taiwan and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, said Lai's remarks may have been timed to preempt talks between Xi and Trump, who has claimed a meeting will happen in the not too distant future. And I think this all definitely connects with the Trump administration's anti-China policy, absolutely. But at the same time, we also have to understand that it is I think the rivalry between China and the United States is very serious, given the fact that China has the second biggest economy in the world, and given the fact that the United States doesn't want any competitors. So this is why I say that the Americans want to use the Japanese as a proxy. Taiwan's defense ministry on Tuesday released a security plan for the next 4 years that called the U.S. a crucial strategic partner, especially in reconnaissance, long-range precision strike capability, and military hardware. The ministry pledged to cooperate more with the U.S. in intelligence sharing, etc., etc. And then it says here that the military on Monday launched 5 days of rapid-fire exercises to practice mobilizing in the event one of China's drills turn into an attack. And it says here that he's definitely tougher, but he's trying to find a new narrative to deal with China, etc., etc. So Washington is using the Taiwanese to provoke the Chinese. That's what I think is happening. Just like they use the Ukrainians to provoke the Russians. Tokyo. President Trump in early March criticized what he characterized as a one-sided security alliance between the U.S. and Japan. So what the Americans are doing with the Europeans, they're also doing with the Japanese. Trump is saying, I don't know if we can trust the Europeans. The Europeans need to start making their own stuff. The Europeans need to start being more militarily independent. What is the United States doing? The United States is goading the Europeans to boost their military capabilities up. That's what the Americans are doing. As I've said in the past, the Americans want to use the Germans and the Turks as proxies against the Russians. I think this is the plan. As I've said, Russia's biggest historical enemies, the Germans and the Turks. The Americans know this. They say, let's put these two monsters together, form a Leviathan. We got ourselves a giant monster against the Russians. I think this is the plan of the United States. So the Americans, it looks like they're doing, it doesn't look like, it's obvious that the Americans are doing the same thing with the Japanese. We can't trust the Japanese. The Japanese need to spend more on their military, etc., etc. Why? Because they want to get the Japanese samurai back against the Chinese. So it says here that, and this is why Donald Trump says things like, well, if we get attacked, how come the Japanese aren't going to help us? And what does that do? It gives the Japanese the green light, wink, wink, buy more American weapons, maybe even build their own stuff, increase more money, increase the more spending on the Japanese military. All right, this is the whole idea. And it says here, this video starts playing, go away. President Trump in early March criticized what he characterized as a one-sided security alliance between the U.S. and Japan. Officials in Japan have heard these comments from Mr. Trump before, and so far, they have continued shaping the country's national security plans based on the assurances of backing from the United States. Government officials admit they really have no other choice. There is no plan B for Japan other than the U.S. Takuya Akiyama, Principal Deputy Director of the North American Affairs. I hate the titles of these think tanks. Oh my gosh, they're so obnoxiously long. Principal Deputy Director of the North American Affairs Bureau at the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So freaking exhausting. I just go, Takayuma, okay, skip this part. Treaty-wise and also as a physical presence, no other country can substitute the U.S. It is unthinkable. The U.S. may be pulling back from Europe under President Trump, but despite his remarks about Japan, U.S. military cooperation with Tokyo has appeared stable and may even expand as the White House ramps up its standoff with Asia's increasingly assertive superpower, China. That's what this is about. It's about empowering the Japanese. It's about the Americans working more with the Japanese so they can go against the Chinese, because the Chinese, economically speaking, the Chinese are the biggest threat to the U.S. Because as everyone knows, the Chinese have the second biggest economy in the world. And so it says here, China's threat to its neighbors. Japanese officials may have breathed a sigh of relief after Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's visit to the White House in February. The Trump administration reaffirmed its commitment to Japan's defense, including amid Tokyo's dispute with Beijing over ownership of the Senkaku Islands. It is one of many land ownership disputes between China and its neighbors over... Okay. I gotta stop myself for a second there, guys. The Trump administration reaffirmed its commitment to Japan's defense, including amid Tokyo's dispute with Beijing over ownership of the Senkaku Islands. Okay. The Senkaku Islands are just big rocks. Like I said in the past, like I've said before, imagine that World War III is going to begin over some rocks. Be it the rocks coming out of the ocean in East Asia, be it the rock in Mecca that the Persians and the Arabs are fighting over, that the Turks want to control, or be it the Dome of the Rock. World War III is going to start over some rocks. It is one of many land ownership disputes between China and its neighbors over islands in the South China Sea, virtually all of which Beijing claims as its territory. The White House has repeatedly condemned Chinese aggression, blah, blah, blah. And this is why you see these two guys holding hands. The only reason why they're holding hands is because the Americans want to use the samurai to go against the Chinese. That's it. That's the only reason. It says here that advisors to the Japanese Prime Minister spent the months after the U.S. election preparing him for the meeting with Mr. Trump, blah, blah, blah. They focused on whatever, his language, who cares. China has been rapidly bolstering its military capabilities, blah, blah, blah. And it says here, they focused on using clear and concise language to convey the benefits of the security alliances to the U.S. and the increase Japan has made in its own defense spending and military procurement from America. And this is what the Americans want. The Americans want Japan to go back to militarism. Hell, the Japanese could literally go back to worshiping the emperor and doing their weird imperialist dances and carrying a giant cart with the idol, and they believe that the sun god is living inside the cart. I mean, they do rituals like this in Japan. They could literally go back to the whole imperialistic religion that they used to embrace, and the Americans would be clapping their hands. If Japan, I kid you not, if Japan decided to go back to emperor worship, and they start saying that the emperor is God and we have to die for the emperor and the emperor is a reincarnated Buddha and all this bullshit. If they go back to that, I guarantee you conservatives would be saying, well, they're going back to their culture. That's their culture. Liberals hate culture. They especially hate white people culture. And they especially hate any culture that is observed by light-skinned people with high IQs. And the Japanese people, they're high IQ and they're light-skinned. Hell, as far as I'm concerned, they're honorable whites. They're going back to culture. Yeah, but they're boosting up their military capabilities. They're making nuclear bombs. Well, they're trying to fight the commies. And, you know, Our Lady of Fatima warned us about communism, and the Japanese are doing God's work as far as I'm concerned. I kid you not, you would be hearing that kind of bullshit. China announced a 7.2% increase in its defense budget. That's freaking huge, by the way, which was already the world's second highest behind the United States. So China's freaking serious, guys. They're not bullshitting. Taiwan condemned China and deployed its own forces in response as the Chinese military held shooting training drills in the Taiwan Strait. Oh boy, here we go. The rise of the Taiwanese military. From an American perspective, it's clear that if Taiwan falls and if Japan falls, that our alliances in the Indo-Pacific are over. Kenneth Weinstein, Japan chair at the Hudson Institute think tank, told CBS, China will exercise extraordinary military sway, will be able to close down global shipping such as they see it, will be able to throttle access to the South China Sea and elsewhere. So the Japanese better get the samurai spirit back online. They better revive the Japanese samurai spirit. And hell, maybe they'll start worshiping the sun god again. Who knows? But let me tell you guys something. No matter what disturbing stuff the Japanese do, if the Japanese do disturbing stuff, the conservatives will be clapping their hands. And the neocons and the neolibs and all these demonic people, they would be clapping their hands and saying Godspeed. How do I know this? When Ukraine did war crimes in Kursk, how many people actually gave a damn? Not a lot, and surely not enough. There have already been tense encounters between Japanese and Chinese vessels, naval vessels, around the Senkaku Islands, a group of uninhabited islands, rocks, claimed by both Beijing and Tokyo. The whole world has to be dragged into hell over some rocks, everyone. How am I going to die in the future? You're going to die fighting for rocks. It may be in Asia. It may be in Mecca, over the rock that they worship. They call it the Kaaba. Or it may be over the Dome of the Rock. I think World War III is going to be started over rocks. As crazy as that sounds, that's actually a realistic prediction. It's a plausible prediction. Isn't that crazy? My cat is meowing right now. Kitty, what do you want? According to data from Japan's Coast Guard, Chinese government vessels entered the maritime zone around the islands, which China calls the Diaoyus or the Diaoyus on 355 or 360 on 355 of the 366 days of 2024, the highest number of intrusions reported by Japan. Of course, they're going to go to the Senkaku Islands. They literally and sincerely believe it belongs to them. The highest number of intrusions reported by Japan since China started operating around the islands in 2008. The Chinese vessels operating around the islands have increased not only in number, but in armament, carrying more and larger weapons as they circle the disputed rocks, They encircle the rocks, according to officials, blah, 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 blah. Where are the islands? Where are the rocks? Where are the rocks in the map? Where are the rocks? We better do something or we're all going to have to speak Mandarin. I mean, listen, I think that's actually pretty cool. I wouldn't mind speaking Mandarin. I think it's a pretty language. I do. I think Chinese is a pretty language. I think it sounds very elegant. Wouldn't mind it at all. We're living in a real-life board game of Risk? Yeah, absolutely. So it says here that the, Chinese Communist Party, evil, it's all bad. Japanese people are good. Japan good. China bad. I don't understand all this thing, this dichotomy that they love to float around. China bad, Japan good. I mean, this is really the narrative. But they don't talk about the atrocities that the Japanese committed on the Chinese. I mean, there's a reason why the Chinese do not trust the Japanese. There's a reason why. The Japanese invaded China in the 1930s. They went into the capital of China, the capital city of China, which was Nanking at the time. And after they invaded the city, they proceeded to butcher and rape literally hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of weeks. And it just didn't stop. It just didn't stop. The killing went on and on and on. And overall, the Japanese murdered millions of people in China. So, why in the hell should the Chinese trust the Japanese? You could say, well, that's the past. The Japanese still deny that they even committed atrocities. That's the general consensus in Japan. Yes, there have been Japanese people who have acknowledged the atrocities, but overall, the Japanese government has denied that atrocities were committed. Hell, Shinzo Abe was a big fat denier that there were comfort women. He denied that they were that Japan had sex slaves. He denied that Japan did those atrocities. And if you look at the Japanese parliament, a lot of those politicians in the Japanese parliament will deny that these atrocities were even committed. So why in the hell should China trust this country? If a country comes in, rapes and butchers your people, and then denies that it ever happened, would you trust that country? It's an honest question. It's a sincere question that I have. Would you trust that country? That's the problem. Americans just don't want to understand this because Americans have never been through a genocide. They've never been through a genocide. Imagine if someone invades the U.S., commits a genocide, kills millions of people, rapes countless of your women, and then acts like nothing happened, and then tells you that you're the bad guy. Would you trust that country? I don't think any country would trust that country. I think that's just an obvious reality. So all this stuff about, oh yeah, look how bad China bad, Japan good. That's a bunch of bullshit. It is. It's just bullshit. Shinzo Abe's death seemed personally motivated. Yeah, I think there was definitely a conspiracy there. And I think what happened was, I suspect that it was a conspiracy to actually reinvigorate militarism in Japan, because Shinzo Abe already started this. He already started this agenda to revive Japanese militarism. But the problem is that there were still people in the Japanese parliament who were resistant to this agenda. So what do? How do you allow for the agenda of Shinzo Abe to be intensified? Or how do you enable Shinzo Abe's agenda to be followed through? I think they wanted to make a martyr out of him so they could say, let's now fulfill what Master Abe wanted. And I think that's what it really comes down to. Because that's exactly what happened after he was killed. They started saying, let's fulfill his legacy, and the Parliament of Japan was even more united after he was killed.